Incident Log, Sector 4, National Monitoring Station 09. Timestamp, 02.14. Ambient temperature, 4 degrees Celsius. Wind speed, 3 knots, bearing north-northwest. I was operating a Yamaha Grizzly 450 utility ATV. Tire pressure verified at 12 psi for optimal traction on the damp silt of the valley floor. Per the digital SOP on my Panasonic Toughbook, my shift was restricted to the maintenance of the Sector 4 pluviometers. Minimal movement, minimal exposure. It's a standard bureaucratic assignment, dull, repetitive, and reliable. However, as the halogen beam swept across the rusted iron perimeter of Trail 72, the telemetry didn't match the visual. Trail 72 has been decommissioned for over a decade. According to the old physical journals back at the guard shack, handwritten logs I haven't bothered to digitize because I don't believe in archiving superstition. One is never to patrol this route after 02 Chi. Any gate violations are to be logged as wind damage and ignored. But I'm a technician, not a storyteller. I killed the engine. The silence was absolute, the kind of heavy quiet that suggests the local fauna has moved elsewhere. 3 meters from the gate, 14 pairs of hiking boots were arranged on the trail. They weren't discarded. They were organized by size, ascending from smallest to largest with surgical precision. All toes pointed toward the darkness of the decommissioned trail. Every single lace had been removed. The laces were knotted together into a single, unbroken line that snaked under the gate and vanished into the thick fog beyond. I didn't call it in. I assumed it was a high-effort prank by local transients or a leave-no-trace protest gone weird. My digital log required a GPS-tagged photo of the gate latch to close the hourly ticket, so I stepped off the vehicle. I didn't see the need for the physical ledger's warnings. I had a 500-lumen flashlight and a calibrated radio. I thought that was enough. I filed the initial report regarding the 14 pairs of footwear found at the Trail 72 trailhead under vandalism, tar, and civil disruption. It's the most logical classification, despite the meticulous arrangement. To those of you monitoring these logs, especially those working the 22E to 06 Huing graveyard shifts in remote sectors, I'm looking for data correlation. If you've encountered similar, nonsensical protocols or environmental anomalies that your superiors refuse to justify with hard data, leave a like on this entry. It serves as a necessary verification that I'm not experiencing isolation-induced cognitive decline. Subscribe to follow the chronological sequence of these incident logs as I move deeper into the sector. I'm transitioning to the inner perimeter now. Recording paused. Log entry, 02:14 a.m., Monitoring Station 09, Sector 4. Current soil moisture levels are holding at 84%, with a localized fog density increasing at a rate of 12% per hour. I spent the better part of my shift recalibrating the VHF transceiver to 154.515 MHz. The signal has been drifting, typical for these older units, though I've logged it as a potential capacitor failure for the maintenance team. It's the kind of repetitive, granular work that keeps you grounded in this job. Underneath my workstation sits a stack of physical journals left by the previous rangers. They're filled with frantic, ink-smeared warnings about listening for the silence and instructions to never look directly at the canopy on Trail 72. I don't read them. It's a classic case of isolation-induced psychosis, combined with a lack of technical literacy. These men were victims of their own minds, letting the forest scale overwhelm their rational faculties. I prefer my Garmin GPS Map 66SR and my thermal telemetry. Digital sensors don't have feelings or superstitions. During the 02 a.m. perimeter check, I reached the access gate for Trail 72. Administrative Directive 14B is explicit. The trail is off-limits after 02 a.m., and any gate discrepancies must be logged as wind damage. It's a lazy bureaucratic fix for aging infrastructure. I found the Grade 5 industrial padlock open. It hadn't been cut or forced with a pry bar. The steel had been perfectly fused and resealed while in the unlocked position, the metal smooth to the touch as if melted by a precision chemical torch and instantly cooled. My immediate assessment: professional poachers using high-end industrial tools. The idea of logging this as wind was an insult to my training. Ignoring the directive, I adjusted my tactical light and stepped past the gate. I had 4 bars of satellite reception and a full battery on my thermal scanner. I didn't need a journal to tell me how to do my job. 02:24 a.m. I kept the Kawasaki brute force at a steady 15 kilometers per hour. Any faster on Trail 72, and you're asking for a punctured tire or a broken axle on the protruding limestone. The headlights cut a weak, yellowish path through the fog, which had thickened into something that felt less like water vapor and more like wet wool. I tapped the display on my ruggedized tablet mounted to the handlebars. The telemetry was green, but the map rendering was sluggish. I attributed it to the canopy density. Even in the off-season, the overhead oak and pine in Sector 4 create a near-perfect Faraday cage for consumer-grade signals. That's when the radio started. It wasn't a voice or a distress call. It was a rhythmic pulse of static. 3 short bursts, 1 long. It wasn't random atmospheric interference. I shifted my weight, thinking I was sitting on the mic, but the handheld was clipped securely to my chest rig. I slowed the quad to a crawl, and the pulse slowed with me. I accelerated to 20 km/h, and the frequency of the static increased. It was perfectly synchronized with the rotation of my tires. Physics doesn't work that way. Radio interference is electromagnetic, not mechanical. I pulled the brake, the engine idling with a low metallic thrum, and the static stopped instantly. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy against your eardrums. I logged it as a localized electromagnetic anomaly, possibly due to subterranean mineral deposits, and kept moving. I wasn't going to let a bit of feedback turn me back. I reached the old meteorological substation near mile marker 4 by 02:42 a.m. It's a small prefab shack that's been technically decommissioned since the late 90s, but still houses some legacy analog backup gear. I needed to check if the vandal I suspected was using it as a base. I cut the engine. The silence that rushed in was immediate and absolute. No crickets, no wind in the branches. Just the cooling ping of the quad's exhaust manifold. As I stepped off the vehicle, the smell hit me. It wasn't the rot of a dead deer or the musk of a black bear. It was sharp, clinical, and oppressive. Ozone and wet copper. It smelled like a server room that had just caught fire, mixed with the iron tang of a butcher shop. I pulled my maglite and swept the perimeter. No footprints, no signs of a forced entry, no campfire ash. The ground was undisturbed, yet the smell was so thick I could almost taste the metal on the back of my tongue. I unlocked the door with the master key. The hinges didn't creak, which was odd for a building that hadn't been serviced in 3 years. Inside, the air was dry and carried a fine layer of dust, except for the filing cabinet in the corner. It was a standard 4-drawer steel unit, rusted at the base, but the second drawer was slightly ajar. I pulled it open. No digital files here, just the smell of decaying paper and that lingering ozone. I found a leather-bound patrol log from 1998. Most of the entries were the usual bureaucratic fluff: weather readings, fence repairs, minor trespassing. But the last entry, dated November 12th, was different. The handwriting was precise, a cold, technical script that mirrored my own reporting style. It didn't mention ghosts or monsters. It said, 03:15 a.m., spatial displacement observed at marker 72, variance exceeds 400 meters, compass orientation inverted. Directive 14B applies. Do not report spatial displacement. Register the resulting time loss as operator error or equipment calibration failure. Return to base immediately via reverse track. I stared at the page. This wasn't the rambling of a terrified amateur. This was a professional being told to lie by the department. I felt a cold prickle of irritation rather than fear. If the Forest Service knew about geological or magnetic anomalies in this sector, they should have updated the digital safety protocols instead of burying it in a paper log from 25 years ago. It's a liability. I pulled out my Garmin GPS to mark the cabin's coordinates and cross-reference them with the 1998 entry. I waited for the satellite lock. 1 bar, 2 bars. The screen flickered, the topographic map jittering violently before settling. I looked at the coordinates, then at the map overlay. According to the GLONASS and GPS constellation, I wasn't at the substation. I wasn't even on Trail 72. The blue dot on the screen placed me exactly 42 kilometers to the east, in the center of Lake Stillwell. According to my equipment, I was currently 30 feet underwater. I shook the unit, then gave it a sharp rap against my palm. Signal bounce, I muttered. The fog must be refracting the satellite pings, creating a multipath error. It's a common technical phenomenon in high-moisture environments. But as I looked back at the logbook on the desk, the ink on the page seemed fresher. The smell of copper intensified, and for the first time, I noticed that while I was standing still, the rhythmic static from my quad's radio had started up again. Slow, methodical, pulsing from the darkness outside the cabin door, even though the vehicle's ignition was off. 02:41 a.m. Visibility reduced to approximately 3 meters. The fog in Sector 4 isn't your standard meteorological event. It's a saturated gray particulate that seems to absorb the beam of my mag light rather than reflect it. It feels heavy, like moving through pressurized water. I've logged 2 previous incidents of heavy fog this month, but the density here at the mouth of Trail 72 is anomalous. My thermal optics are useless. The screen is a flat, uniform wash of static white, indicating the ambient temperature of the fog exactly matches the ambient temperature of the trees, and likely my own skin. A thermal equilibrium that shouldn't exist in a living forest. I decided to initiate a tactical retreat. Protocol 12 Bravo dictates that when visibility drops below 5 meters and telemetry fails, the ranger must return to the nearest hardpoint station. I put the quad into reverse, but the tires just spun against the loam. The soil felt wrong. It wasn't the loose, damp pine needles I'd driven over minutes ago. It felt like wet clay, or worse, uncurled velvet. I dismounted to check the tread. That's when I saw the first marker. The standard reflective trail markers in this park are 4-inch by 6-inch aluminum plates, coated in high-visibility orange, nailed into the bark of Douglas firs at eye level. This one was different. As I swung my light over the trunk of a massive pine, I didn't see a plate nailed to the surface. Instead, I saw a perfectly rectangular slit in the wood, about 6 inches deep. Inside that slit, encased in the very heartwood of the tree, was the orange marker. I didn't panic. Panic is for tourists. I approached the tree, gloved hand reaching out to trace the bark. The wood was smooth, lacking the rough texture of a mature fir. It felt like it had been molded or extruded. The bark had grown around, the metal plate in a way that would take 50 years of natural growth, yet the aluminum wasn't corroded. It was pristine. I checked the next tree. Same thing, and the next. 12 markers in a row, all surgically embedded within the timber, visible only through these impossible rectangular gashes. High-effort vandalism, I muttered to myself, though my throat felt tight. Someone with a CNC machine and a lot of time could, theoretically, graft these into the trees. But the scale was wrong. The biology was impossible. I took a photo for the digital log, but the screen on my ruggedized tablet showed only a black frame with a file corrupt error. I reached for my shoulder-mounted radio. Motorola APX 8000. It's supposed to be encrypted, long-range, and fail-proof. I keyed the mic. Base 09, this is Elias. I am 400 yards into Trail 72, encountering localized biological anomalies and severe visibility loss, requesting a secondary frequency check. Over. There was no static, no squelch, just a sudden sharp clarity that made my ears ring. Morning report for November 14th, a voice said through the speaker. My heart skipped a beat, a physical thud in my chest. It was my voice. Not a recording of what I just said, but a recording of me, Elias, reading the weather briefing for tomorrow morning. I recognized the specific, tired cadence I used during the 06 a.m. shift change. Expecting a cold front from the north with a 20% chance of precipitation in Sector 4. All trails clear, no incidents reported in the last 24 hours. End of log. The audio had a strange, muffled quality to it. It sounded like I was speaking from inside a lead-lined box, or perhaps from 10 feet underwater. The Elias on the radio sounded calm, boringly professional. But the Elias standing in the fog was holding a dead piece of plastic that shouldn't be receiving signals from the future. I turned the volume dial to 0. The voice didn't stop. It continued to loop the report, leaking out of the sealed speaker housing even though the power light was now red, indicating a drained battery. I felt a sudden, sharp prickling on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched by something that doesn't use eyes. I looked back at the trees. The rectangular slits in the wood were shifting. Not much, but enough to notice. The wood was slowly closing, the bark knitting itself shut over the orange markers. It was silent. No wind, no insects. Just the sound of my own voice coming from a dead radio, telling me that tomorrow I will report that absolutely nothing happened tonight. I pulled my sidearm, not because I had a target, but because the weight of the metal was the only thing that felt real. My GPS still insisted I was at the bottom of a lake 40 miles away. My watch had stopped at 02:41, the second hand twitching back and forth like a dying insect. I realized then that the trail wasn't just a path through the woods anymore. It was a closed loop. The physics of the park were being rewritten in real time, and my digital equipment was merely recording the funeral of my own rationality. I began to walk back toward where I thought the quad was, but the smell of ozone and copper grew so thick I could taste it on my tongue. the metallic tang of a looming lightning strike or an open vein. 02:44 a.m. Internal log entry. I shifted the Yamaha Kodiak 450 into reverse, the engine's low-end torque whining against the thick, saturated mud of Trail 72. According to basic physics and my own ocular observation from 3 minutes prior, there should have been a clear set of deep-tread tire tracks leading back toward the gate. I moved exactly 10.4 meters. Then, the resistance stopped. The tires weren't spinning in mud. They were crunching on something brittle and dry. I brought the vehicle to a full stop and engaged the electronic parking brake. I didn't reach for my sidearm. I reached for my Pelican 7600 tactical flashlight. High output mode, 944 lumens. The beam cut through the fog like a surgical blade, but the atmospheric density had shifted. The fog wasn't just water vapor anymore. It had a yellow-gray hue and a viscosity that seemed to resist the light. I stepped off the quad, my boots still caked in the heavy black sludge of the lower trail. But the ground beneath the tires was gone. Not eroded, not covered. Replaced. In a perfect concentric circle around the vehicle, the mud had been substituted by a dense layer of dry, reddish-brown pine needles. They were bone dry. I knelt down and ran a gloved hand through them. There hasn't been a pine tree within a 3-mile radius of Sector 4 for over 20 years due to the beetle infestation of '99. This was a geographical impossibility. I checked the tread marks. They stopped at the edge of the needle line, as if they had been sheared off by a guillotine. No transition, no displacement, just a hard, binary swap of terrain. I logged this as a localized spatial anomaly, though my brain was already trying to find a more comfortable lie. Perhaps a massive coordinated prank by local activists using pre-laid mats. But the scale and the silence made that theory a dead end. The silence was the worst part. At this hour, the forest should be a cacophony of insects and nocturnal movement. Instead, it was an acoustic vacuum. The only sound was the cooling metal of the quad's manifold, pinging in the dark. I swept the light further back, looking for the gate, but the beam died out in the fog after 20 feet. That's when I saw the first white speck in the needles. I moved closer, keeping my center of gravity low, standard tactical approach. It wasn't a stone. It was a human molar, an adult M3, fully rooted, no signs of decay. Then I saw another, and another. I didn't panic. I am a professional. I began a grid search of the immediate area. Within a 2-meter radius, I found exactly 48 molars. They weren't scattered. They were arranged. They were laid out in a precise geometric pattern. A series of concentric triangles, each apex pointing with mathematical certainty deeper into the forest, away from the exit. The precision was what bothered me. It wasn't a ritualistic mess. It looked like a data chart. Like something was trying to communicate a vector using the only organic material it had on hand. As I leaned over to photograph the arrangement for the digital incident report, a sudden, violent shift in atmospheric pressure hit me. My ears didn't just pop, they throbbed. The smell of ozone, the sharp electric scent that precedes a lightning strike, returned, but this time it was laced with the heavy metallic tang of raw copper. It was so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. It tasted like sucking on a handful of old pennies. Then came the physical sensation in my jaw. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was a high-frequency vibration, a sympathetic resonance. Every tooth in my mouth began to ache with a deep, pressurized throb, as if the roots were being pulled by a powerful electromagnet hidden beneath the forest floor. I could feel my fillings heating up. The vibration moved up into my sinuses, a rhythmic clicking that matched the static I had heard on the radio earlier. I checked my ruggedized tablet. The screen was a chaotic mess of flickering pixels. The GPS coordinate displayed was cycling through numbers so fast it was unreadable, but the elevation reading was fixed. 300 meters. According to the telemetry, I was currently 300 meters underground. I looked up at the towering, impossible trees and the swirling yellow fog. Logic dictated a sensor failure. Experience dictated that the sensors were fine, and the reality was what had failed. I turned back to the quad, intending to ignore the wind damage protocol and call in a code 10, officer in distress. But when I looked at the Kodiak, the digital dashboard was glowing with a soft, pulsing violet light. The odometer wasn't counting miles anymore. It was counting backward, the numbers spinning down toward zero with an aggressive, mechanical hunger. I reached for the radio on my shoulder, but before I could key the mic, a voice burst through the static. It wasn't my voice this time. It was the sound of a forest fire, the roar of burning timber, pitched and modulated to sound like a human scream, sustained and perfectly level. I realized then that the teeth on the ground weren't just a signpost, they were a tally. I counted them again. 48. I felt a sudden sharp crack in my own jaw. I spat into my hand. A molar. No blood, no pain, just a clean, dry extraction. 49. I wasn't just observing the anomaly anymore. I was being integrated into its inventory. 03:14 a.m. I placed the molar, my molar, into a sterile evidence bag. I didn't feel the pain I should have. The nerve was dead, or perhaps the atmospheric pressure had simply numbed the maxillary branch. My digital watch flickered, the liquid crystal display bleeding black ink across the numbers before resetting to Yero. Every sensor on my utility belt was screaming in its own way. The Geiger counter hummed at a low, persistent 0.05 microsieverts, background noise, yet rhythmic, and the thermal imager showed the trees around me at a constant, uniform 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the temperature of a healthy human body, not a forest in the middle of a damp October night. I abandoned the quadricycle. The engine had seized, the metal housing of the radiator having expanded and fused into the block as if the laws of thermodynamics had decided to take a shift off. I moved forward because the trail behind me had ceased to be a trail. It was a vertical incline of dry needles now, defying gravity. I stayed on the only horizontal plane available. I was trained for search and rescue, for fire containment, for animal control. I was not trained for a topographical collapse. After 300 yards of pushing through brush that felt more like coarse hair than pine needles, I broke into a clearing. This shouldn't exist. Sector 4 is a series of rolling hills and glacial till. There are no flat basins, and there certainly are no sheer obsidian-slick rock faces. But there it was. A wall of smooth black stone, 30 feet high, stretching into the fog as if someone had dropped a massive, light-absorbing divider across the world. My flashlight beam hit the surface and simply vanished. No reflection, no diffusion. The light just stopped. And then I saw it. Park Service Property ID, 884 Delta 09. It was a Yamaha Grizzly 700, standard issue. It was leaning against the base of the black wall. At first, I thought I had somehow looped back to my own vehicle, but the state of this machine was a violent contradiction. It was covered in a thick, wet layer of emerald moss. The tires were cracked. The rubber degraded into a brittle, gray substance. The steel frame was so heavily oxidized that the front rack had collapsed under its own weight. The seat had been hollowed out, not by animals, but by slow, methodical rot. I approached it with my hand on my sidearm, a gesture of pure habit that felt increasingly pathetic. I wiped the grime off the serial number plate on the lower chassis. I didn't need a logbook to confirm it. I've performed the maintenance on 884 Delta 09 for 3 years. I know the scratch on the left fender where I hit a stump in 2021. This was my quad, but this vehicle had been sitting here for at least 30 years. The rust was deep, structural, biting into the alloy in a way that defied the 3 hours I'd been on duty. On the rotted remains of the seat sat my metal clipboard. My fingers trembled, a physiological response I couldn't suppress, as I picked it up. The aluminum was pitted with corrosion, but the top sheet of paper was preserved under the plastic film. It was the shift log I had started at midnight. I could see my own signature at the bottom of the 01 a.m. entry. But there were more entries. Entries I hadn't written, or rather, entries I hadn't written yet. 03:45 a.m. The wall is breathing. I can't find the teeth I lost. 04:12 a.m. Protocol 72 is not a safety measure. It is a containment perimeter. 04:30 a.m. The inventory is almost complete. The handwriting was mine. Every loop of the L, every sharp slant of the S. It was a perfect forensic match. My clinical detachment finally cracked. I wasn't looking at a crime scene or a prank. I was looking at a temporal sinkhole. The reason the Bureau told us to log Trail 72 violations as wind damage wasn't to save on paperwork. It was to ensure that no one ever looked closely enough to see the inventory being taken. We weren't rangers patrolling a park. We were auditors for a meat grinder. I stepped back, the clipboard clattering against the rusted metal of the dead quad. The silence of the forest changed. The heavy, oppressive quiet was replaced by a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up in a primal, electrified terror. It was the sound of respiration. A wet, heavy intake of air, followed by a long, whistling exhale. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from directly above me. I didn't look up. I couldn't, because the rhythm of the breathing was perfectly synchronized with my own. Every time I caught my breath in a sob of panic, The air above me shuddered in the exact same cadence. I realized then that the black wall wasn't stone. It was a mirror that didn't reflect light, only biology, and whatever was on the other side was finally matching my frequency. 03:12 a.m. The telemetry on my chest cam didn't just fail, it inverted. The screen was showing a thermal readout of a temperature gradient that shouldn't exist, -40 degrees Celsius, while the sweat was stinging my eyes in the humid, 90-degree air of the Sector 4 basin. I stopped trying to reboot the handheld GPS. It was still insisting I was floating in the middle of a lake 50 miles north. I dropped the unit into the ferns. It didn't make a sound when it hit the ground. It just vanished into the static heavy silence of Trail 72. Then the flickering started. My headlamp's lithium-ion battery was rated for 12 hours. It had been on for 2. Every time the beam died for a microsecond, the geometry of the forest shifted. I'd blink, and a Douglas fir that was 20 feet ahead was now 5 feet to my left, its bark appearing stretched, almost liquid, as if it had been dragged through the frames of a low bitrate video. The trees weren't moving. The space between them was being deleted. I didn't scream. Screaming is for people who still believe someone is listening. I am a senior ranger. I know that in Sector 4, sound is just data, and right now, the data was being corrupted. I could still hear my own breathing, but it was coming from the canopy 30 feet above my head. It was wet, labored, and perfectly synchronized with the rise and fall of my own chest. I reached for the only non-digital tool I had left, a high-intensity magnesium flare. I didn't strike it to signal for help. There is no help for a Code 72 violation. I struck it because magnesium burns at a frequency that forces the physical world to stabilize. The moment the white-blue glare erupted, the shifting shadows snapped back into place with a sound like a wet bedsheet being torn in half. The forest groaned. The smell of ozone and copper became so thick I could taste the metal on the back of my tongue. I ignored the pain in my jaw. I had lost another molar. I felt the empty socket with my tongue. But there was no blood. The forest was harvesting me, piece by piece, filing me into its impossible inventory. I pulled my analog magnetic compass from my belt. The needle was spinning like a propeller, useless. I closed my eyes. I had patrolled these woods for 12 years. I didn't need a needle. I needed memory. I began to walk in a straight line, perpendicular to the last known position of the mountain ridge. I didn't look at the trees. I didn't look at the me that was staring back from the reflective surface of the black rock walls I passed. Every time my flare sputtered, the ground beneath my boots felt like it was turning into teeth, hard, ridged, and ivory white. I kept moving. I used the flare like a cauterizing iron for reality, burning a hole through the anomaly. My ears began to bleed. The pressure was identical to being at the bottom of a deep-sea trench. The Elias above me in the trees started screaming my name, but the voice was wrong. It sounded like a recording played at double speed, mechanical and hollow. Elias, check the gate. Elias, wind damage. Elias, it's just the wind. I didn't look up. I focused on the mechanical act of putting one boot in front of the other. Left, right, strike another flare. Left, right. The magnesium light revealed things I can't put in a standard report. I saw the quad bike I had supposedly lost earlier, but it wasn't just old. It was fused into the trunk of an oak tree, the metal and wood woven together like a basket. My own name was carved into the seat in a handwriting I haven't used since grade school. I reached the edge of the tree line at 05:48 a.m. The transition wasn't gradual. One step, I was in the suffocating metallic dark of Trail 72. The next, my boots hit the cold, honest asphalt of State Route 12. The sun was a thin gray sliver on the horizon. The silence was normal again. Crickets, the distant hum of a truck, the wind. Real wind. I didn't look back. I walked 4 miles to the nearest maintenance shed, my lungs burning with air that finally felt three-dimensional. When I reached the station, I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't call the chief ranger. I sat at my desk and opened the digital log for the final time. I typed 06:15 a.m. Patrol ended. Equipment loss. 1 Polaris Sportsman 450. Cause, structural damage due to localized erosion. Trail 72 gate secured. I didn't mention the teeth. I didn't mention the voice in the canopy. I didn't mention that when I looked in the mirror, my eyes were a different color. I just printed the report, signed it, and placed my badge on top of the stack of old, dusty journals I had spent years mocking. The journals were right. The paper remembers what the sensors are programmed to forget. I cleared my locker in 6 minutes. I kept my analog compass, not because it works, but because it's the only thing I have that didn't lie to me. I'm driving east now. I don't think I'll stop until I can't smell pine trees anymore. This concludes my official incident report for Sector 4. To any ranger assigned to Monitoring Station 09, read the physical logs, trust the paper. If the digital clock skips a second, leave. If you find a tooth that isn't yours, run. There is another incident report from the Appalachian Detail, filed by a scout who saw the same shifting geometry. I don't know if the narrator made it out, or if the report was written by something else using his hands. The link is below. Read it before they archive it. This is Ranger Elias, signing off, permanently.